So, here is a slightly terrifying reality to consider the next time you walk into a hiring manager's office. Within the first 60 seconds of a major job interview, the vast majority of candidates they've already completely lost control of the room.
Oh, absolutely. And the worst part is they don't even realize it's happening.
Right. Because, I mean, they're smiling, they're shaking hands, settling into their chair, but the power dynamic has already just slipped right through their fingers. And it happens because they fundamentally misunderstand the very first words out of the interviewer's mouth, which is, so tell me about yourself.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably the most predictable question in the corporate world, right? But it just consistently causes the most damage because, well, candidates hear that prompt and their brain just instantly miscategorizes it. They think, this is the warm-up. This is just the social icebreaker before the real interrogation begins.
Exactly. And so they treat their professional history like a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. They literally take the box, turn it upside down, and just dump every single piece onto the table. I mean, the relevant pieces, the edge pieces, the weird middle pieces from a totally different puzzle.
Yeah, just a massive pile of cardboard.
Right. And they look across the table, essentially asking the interviewer to do all the heavy lifting of assembling those random scraps into a cohesive picture of why they're the perfect hire.
Which is, I mean, that expectation is just completely backward. The interviewer is not there to assemble your puzzle. They're there to evaluate the completed picture. So if you force them to sift through this chronological dump of your entire life story, you're basically exhausting their cognitive bandwidth before the interview has even genuinely started.
Wow. Yeah. Which brings us directly to the payoff of the cliffhanger we left you with in our last deep dive. We are continuing our extensive breakdown of the project management interview series from the Critical Path channel. And specifically, today we're looking at episode 5, titled, How to Answer Tell Me About Yourself Like a Senior PM.
Yeah, this is really the flagship deep dive of Act 2 of this material.
It is, and in our last discussion, we introduced the 5-domain framework, and we told you that domain 1, which is this opening introduction, is not just a question, it is literally the master structure for the entire interview.
That is the pivotal insight right there. Domain 1 is not a biographical exercise. It is an architectural decision. Whatever you decide to place on the table in those opening minutes, well, that dictates the exact territory the interviewer will spend the next 50 minutes exploring. You aren't answering a question, you're actually designing the exam you're about to take.
Okay, let's pause and really explore the mechanics of that, because it's a huge shift in perspective. You're saying that every detail I volunteer is like a deliberate thread I am leaving visible, just hoping the interviewer pulls it.
Precisely. Let's look at the immediate causality in the room. If you open your mouth and mention that you recently got your project management professional certification, your PMP, you have just architected a methodology question.
Oh, because they have to ask about it now.
Exactly. The interviewer is going to pull that thread.
Right.
If you mention you spent, say, 3 years navigating the compliance landscape in healthcare, you've just invited a question about risk mitigation.
Right.
Or if you casually toss out that you manage offshore development teams, the interviewer is instantly formulating a question about asynchronous communication and cultural alignment. I mean, every single noun you use is a target you are painting on your own back.
So the strategic candidate isn't just reciting their resume. They're setting very specific traps. They are choosing the battlefield. But wait, I have to ask. If I'm selectively choosing which threads to leave visible, I'm inevitably leaving out a massive amount of my own history, right? Doesn't that go against the natural instinct to be thorough? I feel like most people have this overwhelming urge to give the full picture because, they worked really hard for those experiences.
Well, the urge to be comprehensive is completely natural. But in an interview setting, it's honestly a fatal liability. You have a functional window of about 5 to 6 minutes to deliver your opening pitch before the interviewer's attention span just critically degrades.
5 to 6 minutes. That's it.
That's it. It is a mathematical impossibility to cover a 10 or 15-year career comprehensively in 5 minutes. If you try, you just end up speaking at this breathless pace, delivering a shallow chronological list of job titles that leaves absolutely zero lasting impression.
Yeah, you're basically just reciting your LinkedIn profile out loud. And I mean, they already have that sitting on the desk right in front of them.
Exactly. You add no new value. And worse, a shallow summary invites no meaningful follow-ups. If you cover everything, you highlight nothing. The interviewer has nothing to grab onto, so they just default to pulling out a generic behavioral questionnaire that you have no control over. You essentially surrendered the architecture.
Oh, man. Okay, so we need to transition from this abstract idea of being an architect into the concrete, tactical tools we use to actually build the structure. Because if we shouldn't walk chronologically through our resume, how do we sequence our introduction? And the source material provides this brilliant, almost invisible compression structure for this. It's the PEAK framework, P-E-K.
Yes. The PEAK framework stands for Personal, Experience, Environment, and Knowledge. It takes the sprawling chaos of your professional biography and ruthlessly categorizes it into 4 distinct, highly targeted dimensions. But there's a very critical mechanical note we need to make right away about this.
Right, the delivery order.
Yeah. Well, the acronym is PEAK for the sake of memory. The actual delivery sequence, the order in which you verbalize these concepts in the room, is strictly EKEP.
EKEP, experience, knowledge, environment, personal.
Exactly.
Okay, I want to spend significant time unpacking each of these because the depth of what goes into these buckets completely changes depending on your seniority. And remember, our mission today is specifically tailored to mid-level professionals who are, preparing to step up into their very first truly senior level role. So let's start with the first element in the delivery sequence, which is experience. Why does experience have to be the tip of the spear?
Because experience establishes immediate, undeniable relevance. We had to look at the psychological state of the hiring manager sitting across from you. They are not interviewing you for fun.
No, definitely not.
They are in pain. They have a massive gap in their operational capability. Like projects are hemorrhaging money, stakeholders are furious, or maybe their internal teams are burning out from a lack of leadership. They need a problem solved yesterday.
Right. They aren't looking to sponsor your personal growth journey. They are literally looking for a firefighter.
Exactly. And the absolute fastest way to lower their anxiety and prove you can put out their fire is to demonstrate a track record of extinguishing highly similar fires. You don't lead with where you went to university or some philosophical quote about leadership. You lead with heavy, concrete metrics that validate their decision to bring you into the room in the first place.
So what does that actually sound like? Like, what is the tangible data I need to inject into this first minute of my answer?
You need to communicate the scale and complexity of your operational history immediately. So you do not say, I have been managing projects for a while. You say something like, for the last 8 years, I have been directing complex infrastructure transformations, typically managing portfolios of 3 to 4 concurrent initiatives with individual project budgets ranging from $2 to $5 million.
Wow, that is incredibly dense. Let's break down why that works so well. In literally one breath, you gave them your seniority timeline, 8 years. You gave them your sector infrastructure transformations. You proved your capacity for cognitive load, 3 to 4 concurrent initiatives. And you established your financial gravity, $2 to $5 million.
And you did it without sounding boastful at all. You were literally just stating the operational parameters of your daily life. A senior hiring manager hears that, and their subconscious just immediately relaxes. They think, okay, this person is playing in the right weight class. They aren't going to be crushed by the scale of what we do here.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Okay, so we've dropped the anchor with experience. You've proven you operate at the required scale. Now we move to the K in our EKEP sequence, which is knowledge.
Right, so knowledge represents your technical command of the craft. Experience proves you have done the work. But knowledge proves you understand how the work is actually functioning beneath the hood. This is the domain where you discuss, methodologies, formal certifications, and your mastery of specific enterprise tooling.
And this is where we really need to highlight the shift from mid-level to senior, right? Because a junior project manager's knowledge bucket looks very different from a senior's.
Completely different. A junior or mid-level PM can often survive on just raw, boots-on-the-ground experience. They're essentially executing a playbook that a more senior leader designed. But when you're interviewing for a senior role, the expectation fundamentally shifts. The source material actually refers to this as becoming a custodian of the craft.
Custodian of the craft. I really love that phrasing. It implies a sense of guardianship over the standards of the profession.
Precisely. At the senior level, you cannot just list off that you use Agile or Waterfall. You have to articulate the architectural why. You need to explain why a highly governed predictive waterfall methodology was the correct risk mitigation strategy for a specific regulatory project, but why you pivoted to, say, an iterative Agile framework for a digital product launch.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it's the difference between blindly following a recipe and actually understanding the chemical reactions of the ingredients.
For anyone listening who might not be a project manager by trade, let's just ground some of this terminology quickly. When we talk about methodologies like Agile or Waterfall or certifications like the PMP Project Management Professional or the PMI ACP for Agile practitioners, we are talking about the strict, standardized frameworks that govern how multi-million-dollar initiatives are run. It's basically the difference between building a house by just nailing wood together versus using structural engineering blueprints.
And the hiring manager needs to know you can read those blueprints. I mean, if you claim to have managed $5 million projects, but you can't articulate the formal governance structures you use to control that money, they're just going to assume you got lucky. The knowledge bucket eliminates the suspicion that you are a charismatic amateur.
Okay, wow. All right, moving to the third element in the delivery sequence. Environment. I found this to be the most fascinating part of the framework because it feels like a completely untapped secret weapon. Like, most people don't even think to talk about this.
It is drastically underutilized. Environment is all about contextual fit. It describes the ecosystem in which you have been applying your experience and knowledge. So are you coming from a highly matrixed global pharmaceutical company, or are you coming from a hyper-growth Series B tech startup? Did you work inside a formal, rigid project management office, or were you embedded directly into scrappy product delivery teams?
Let me push back on this just to play devil's advocate for a second. If project management is a standardized craft-like, if a Gantt chart is a Gantt chart and a wrist register is a wrist register, why does the hiring manager care so much about the ecosystem? Shouldn't my skills transfer anywhere?
In a theoretical vacuum, yes. But in reality, absolutely not, because execution is inextricably linked to environment. Let's use an analogy. Let's say you're a world-class agricultural expert, right? And you have spent 10 years successfully growing crops in the humid tropical environment of a rainforest. You're phenomenal at it.
Okay, tracking.
But if I transplant you to the arid, freezing environment of the tundra, your fundamental knowledge of photosynthesis doesn't change, but your operational playbook is entirely useless. You simply don't know how to survive the environment.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. The soil is different. The threats are completely different.
Exactly. If you've spent 5 years thriving in a startup that has zero formal governance, where decisions are made in hallway conversations, that is a highly valuable skill set. But if you're interviewing at a tier 1 multinational bank, that startup experience might actually be viewed as a liability. The bank requires navigating immense political hierarchy, strict regulatory compliance, and these glacial approval processes.
So by highlighting your environment, you're essentially doing contextual selling.
Yes, you are looking at the hiring manager and saying, not only do I know how to manage projects, but I know how to manage projects inside an ecosystem exactly like yours. I'm already accustomed to your specific brand of corporate friction. It deeply reassures them that you aren't going to suffer from organ rejection on day one.
That is so powerful. Okay, we've established experience, knowledge, and environment. That brings us to the final piece, the P at the very end of the sequence, personal.
The character dimension. And we must be ruthlessly clear about what this bucket is not designed for. This is not the moment to talk about your weekend hiking trips, your passion for rescue dogs, or your amateur photography portfolio.
Right. They do not care that you make your own sourdough starter. I mean, it feels harsh, but in the context of a high-stakes 50-minute interview, it is literally just wasted breath.
It's worse than wasted breath, honestly. It signals a lack of situational awareness. When we say personal in the peak framework, we are referring strictly to operationally relevant character traits. We're talking about the behavioral wiring that dictates how you show up when the project is on fire.
Operationally relevant character traits. Give me some examples of what that looks like in practice.
It's answering the behavioral unknowns. Like, are you the type of leader who thrives in deep strategic ambiguity, taking vague mandates and turning them into clear project charters? Or are you the operational bulldog they send into a failing red project to enforce strict discipline and get it back on track?
Oh, I see.
Yeah. How do you naturally handle highly abrasive senior stakeholders? Are you intensely collaborative, or are you more of a lone wolf executor?
You are telling them how you do the work, not just that you do the work. And when you sequence all four of these together, experience, knowledge, environment, personal, it creates this incredibly seamless narrative. Like, the interviewer is never sitting there thinking, oh, they are deploying a 4-part framework right now. It doesn't sound rehearsed or robotic. It just feels like they're listening to someone who has their professional life beautifully organized.
Exactly. It should feel like a masterfully conducted symphony. The structure is entirely invisible to the audience, but the emotional and logical impact is overwhelming. But here is the critical pivot of our entire discussion.
Lay it on me.
The peak framework is just an empty container. It's a phenomenal container, but it only works if you pour the absolutely correct liquid into it. And deciding what goes into those buckets requires a brutal, highly disciplined editorial process.
Which brings us to the third major concept of this deep dive. Knowing the structure isn't the real challenge. The real challenge is realizing that you have, say, 15 years of history, and you have to somehow compress that into a 5-minute container. How do you decide what spills over and what stays? This is the discipline of selective disclosure.
Yes. Selective disclosure is the concept that makes a lot of honest, hardworking professionals deeply uncomfortable the first time they encounter it. But it is the absolute dividing line between average candidates and elite candidates. You have a vast, complex history. You've worn many hats. You simply cannot fit it all in. Therefore, you must deliberately choose what to highlight based only on the specific, immediate needs of the employer sitting across from you.
Let's use the incredibly vivid example from the source material to make this concrete, because this scenario perfectly illustrates the friction candidates feel. Imagine we have a project manager with 12 years of total professional experience. Let's map out those 12 years.
Okay.
6 years were spent in financial services, 3 years were spent in retail project management, 2 years were in healthcare, and 1 year, maybe during the pandemic or just a major life pivot, was spent managing a restaurant, completely unrelated to corporate PM work. Now, this candidate is sitting in an interview for a senior project manager role at a major bank. How does selective disclosure operate on that 12-year timeline?
It operates like a scalpel.
Yeah.
You have to ruthlessly curate that timeline.
Yeah.
In this specific scenario, applying to a bank, you lead incredibly heavily with 6 years in financial services. That is the core of your peak experience bucket. It maps perfectly to their environment. Next, you actively choose to highlight the 2 years in healthcare.
Wait, why healthcare? A bank isn't a hospital.
Because you are looking for the underlying operational themes. Both banking and healthcare are intensely governed by risk management, regulatory bodies, and strict compliance reporting. The contextual overlap is massive. You highlight healthcare to prove you understand high-stakes governance.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the 3 years in retail?
You drop them. You don't bring them up in your opening pitch at all. Reality is fast, it's highly consumer-driven, but it usually lacks the heavy regulatory burden of a bank. It dilutes your core narrative of being a compliance-heavy financial systems expert.
And the 1 year managing the restaurant?
You erase it entirely from your Domain 1 answer. It simply does not exist in the 5-minute narrative you're constructing.
Okay, here is where I have to step in and challenge this, because I know exactly what the listener is thinking right now. Erase it entirely. Doesn't skipping over an entire year of my resume or pretending 3 years of retail didn't happen in my introduction cross the line into deception? I mean, it feels like hiding something.
We must draw a very hard line here between fabricating facts and curating reality. Deception is modifying reality. Lying is looking at the interviewer and claiming you spent that restaurant year working at Goldman Sachs. That is unethical, and it will get you fired.
Right.
Curating, on the other hand, is simply refusing to volunteer irrelevant information that distracts from the specific value you're trying to sell.
It's like the courtroom analogy. You're the defense attorney. You don't present every single thing your client has ever done since childhood. You only present the specific evidence that proves the specific case you were trying to win today.
Exactly. You are managing the cognitive load of the jury, or in this case, the hiring manager. Every single point you introduce must map directly to a pain point the employer has. If you bring up the restaurant year, what happens?
They get confused.
The interviewer gets totally confused. They pull that thread. Now you're spending 2 minutes of your precious 50-minute interview explaining why you pivoted to hospitality and how you transitioned back. You are wasting time on a tangent that does absolutely nothing to prove you can manage a multi-million-dollar banking integration.
You're literally handing them a piece from a different puzzle and watching them try to jam it into the picture. That is so visual, so you cannot do this level of curation on the fly in the room. If you try to ad-lib selective disclosure, you will panic and revert to chronological rambling. The sources outline a very specific step-by-step workflow for the listener to execute before they ever step foot in the building. What is that preparation process?
It is a 3-step pre-interview workflow. Step 1 is the forensic analysis of the job description. Do not just skim it for keywords, read it line by line and reverse engineer it. If they are asking for experience managing vendors, that means their current vendors are out of control. Identify the underlying pain.
Okay, read between the lines.
Yes. Step 2, conduct external research on the company's current environment. Are they undergoing an agile transformation? Did they just acquire a competitor? What specific tooling do they rely on?
You have to know the ecosystem before you can prove you fit into it. And step 3.
Step 3 is the mapping phase. You lay out your vast, unfiltered professional history, and you actively extract only the pieces that solve the pain points you identified in steps 1 and 2. You build your peak buckets exclusively out of matching components.
All right, so we understand the optimal structure, which is EKEP, and we understand the discipline of filling it, which is selective disclosure. But what happens when people get this wrong? Like, what does it actually sound like in the room when candidates fail to curate or when their peak buckets are wildly out of balance?
The results are disastrous, but they're consistently disastrous in very recognizable ways. Which brings us to the 4th major concept, the 4 imbalance types. When a Domain 1 answer fails, it rarely fails randomly. It fails because it has a specific deformed shape based on a severe imbalance in the candidate's peak profile.
I found this diagnostic section of the material absolutely riveting. We are going to walk through 4 distinct candidate personas. And for you listening, I want you to actively engage with this. Be incredibly honest with yourself. Think back to your last few interviews. Which of these unbalanced personas did you accidentally embody? Let's start with type 1. The source material refers to this persona as the dangerous practitioner. Let's look at Sarah.
Sarah represents a candidate who is massively top-heavy on raw experience, but dangerously thin on knowledge and environment. She's the classic, I don't need a framework, I just get things done. Project manager. She relies entirely on her force of personality and her tenure.
Okay, let's bring Sarah to life. I'm going to read her quote, but let's dissect it as we go. Imagine Sarah sitting across the table from you. She leans in, highly confident, and starts her pitch. Sure, so I have been managing projects for about 10 years now. I started out as a coordinator and worked my way up. I have done all kinds of projects, IT, facilities, HR transformation, you name it.
Let's stop right there. Notice the absolute lack of environmental curation. IT, facilities, HR transformation, you name it. She thinks she is demonstrating versatility, but what the hiring manager actually hears is a lack of specialization. She's a generalist in a world that, at the senior level, absolutely demands specific domain expertise.
She just dumped the whole puzzle box. Okay, she continues. I do not have my PMP, but honestly, I have never needed it. I just get things done. My teams love working with me. I'm very hands-on. I like to know what is happening on my projects at all times.
And there is the fatal blow. I am very hands-on. I like to know what is happening at all times. To an untrained ear, that sounds like dedication. To a senior hiring manager, that is a glaring neon red flag for micromanagement.
Wait, really?
Oh, absolutely. A senior leader cannot possibly know what is happening at all times on a $5 million portfolio. They have to rely on systems, reporting, and delegated authority. Sarah just admitted she doesn't use systems. She uses her own anxiety to drive the project.
That is such a crucial insight. What she thinks is a strength is actually her biggest operational bottleneck. And she finishes with this. I have managed projects with budgets up to $5 million, and I have never missed a go-live date. Any questions?
That final sentence is the equivalent of walking into a trap of your own making. I have never missed a go-live date. In 10 years of multi-million-dollar projects.
Yeah, that's impossible.
The interviewer instantly knows one of 2 things is true. Either Sarah is flat out lying, or, more likely, she aggressively manipulates her baseline schedules to hide delays and artificially claim success.
Right. Real projects encounter friction. Real projects get delayed by external factors. Claiming absolute perfection destroys her credibility completely.
The source material makes a phenomenal comparison here. Hiring Sarah is like meeting a surgeon who confidently boasts about performing 500 successful operations, but then casually admits they never bothered to get a medical license. The raw experience is undeniably there, but the total absence of formal methodology leaves you terrified of what deeply ingrained, undocumented bad habit she's going to bring into your organization.
It's the dangerous practitioner, because when she eventually leaves, she takes the entire operating manual with her in her head.
Exactly.
Okay, let's pivot to type 2, the nerd. Let's look at Marcus. Marcus is the exact inverse of Sarah.
Precisely. Marcus is entirely top-heavy on the knowledge dimension, but paper-thin on actual battle-tested experience. He is all theory and no scars.
Let's listen to Marcus's introduction. Thank you for having me. I am PMP certified with a master's degree in project management from a top 10 university. I have deep expertise in both waterfall and agile methodologies, and I am currently completing my PMI ACP certification.
Pause there. Again, for context, the PMI ACP is the Agile Certified Practitioner credential. Marcus is clearly highly educated. He knows the PMBOK guide, the project management body of knowledge, which is essentially the textbook of the industry. He probably knows it backwards. If this were a university exam, he would absolutely get an A+ like.
But this isn't an exam, he continues. I recently led a framework redesign engagement where I implemented a hybrid governance model based on PMI standards adapted for a lean operational environment. I am very passionate about the science of project management, and I believe strongly in evidence-based delivery. I follow the literature closely, and I've presented at 2 regional chapter events.
So let's analyze the fallout of Marcus's answer. Here is the tragic reality for Marcus. He will almost certainly pass round 1 of the interview process.
So wait, really? After all that theory?
Yes, because round 1 is typically conducted by human resources or an external recruiter. They're usually not PM practitioners themselves. They're working off a checklist.
Right.
Does he have the degree? Yes. Does he have the acronyms? Yes. Marcus sounds incredible on paper, but the moment he advances to round 2 and sits across from a seasoned delivery director, he will fail spectacularly.
Why? What gives him away to the practitioner?
Because the practitioner is listening for evidence of execution under fire. Look at the only actual work experience Marcus referenced. A framework redesign engagement. That is consulting. That is drawing theoretical boxes on a whiteboard and telling other people how they should work. There is absolutely zero evidence of end-to-end delivery.
He hasn't built the building, he just drew the blueprint.
Exactly. He knows the theoretical chemistry of how water puts out fire, but he has never actually stood inside a burning building.
He hasn't felt the heat. An experienced manager knows that theories look great on a whiteboard, but they just fall apart the moment a key vendor goes bankrupt or a stakeholder changes their mind halfway through. Marcus doesn't have the scars to prove he can handle reality. All right, that brings us to type 3, the industry guy. Let's examine Priya.
Priya is completely out of balance in the opposite direction. She is entirely top-heavy on the environment dimension. She knows her specific industry inside and out, but she forgets that she is interviewing for a functional role.
Let's hear Priya's pitch. I have spent the last 8 years in pharmaceutical project management, specifically in the regulatory affairs and clinical trial space. I know this industry deeply. The ICH guidelines, the submission timelines, the FDA approval process.
There, just quickly, ICH guidelines relate to the international standards for pharmaceuticals. Her domain knowledge is incredibly deep. She is speaking the native language of the hiring manager.
It sounds compelling so far. She continues, I have worked with some of the biggest names in the sector, and I understand how these organizations operate politically and operationally. I'm very well networked in this space, and I know where the bodies are buried, so to speak. I would bring immediate industry credibility to your team from day 1.
Now, everything Priya just said is genuinely highly valuable context. It is great to know the regulatory landscape. The fatal flaw is what is entirely missing from her answer. She demonstrated absolutely zero core project management capability.
She didn't mention budgets, she didn't mention methodologies, she didn't mention team size.
Exactly. She is assuming that because she understands the environment of pharmaceuticals, the hiring manager will just naturally assume she knows how to run a project. But industry knowledge is a terrible, crumbling foundation if you cannot actually manage scope creep, control a budget forecast, or hold a matrix team accountable.
I love the analogy for this one. Hiring Priya is like hiring a local tour guide to physically build your house just because they know the neighborhood really well. Yes, they know where the grocery store is, but they don't know how to pour a concrete foundation.
Precisely. If you hire Priya, you get a great consultant on FDA regulations, but you have zero guarantee that the actual clinical trial will launch on time or on budget.
Which brings us to the culmination of all this theory. Type 4, the ideal state, the balanced candidate. Let's look at David. David represents the flawless execution of the EKEP sequence combined with rigorous selective disclosure.
David has done his research. He knows he is sitting in an interview for a senior PM position at a large, highly governed financial services firm that is currently undergoing massive technology transformations. Watch how he curates his reality exclusively for them.
Let's read David's masterpiece. And again, let's break it down piece by piece. He starts. I am a PMP certified project manager with 6 years of experience, primarily in financial services and fintech. I have led technology transformation projects end-to-end, typically running 2 concurrent projects at any given time, with budgets between $1 and $4 million.
Perfect execution of the E and K dimensions right out of the gate. He anchors with his certification, which is knowledge, and immediately layers in his scale, which is experience. 6 years, fintech, concurrent load, massive budgets. In 2 sentences, he has mathematically proven he belongs in the room.
Then he pivots to methodology. My methodology background is hybrid. I was trained in waterfall, but the last 3 years have involved agile delivery in a scaled environment, which I think is increasingly the reality in large financial institutions. I use Smartsheet as my primary tool for schedule management and portfolio reporting.
This is a masterclass in being a custodian of the craft. He doesn't just say he uses Agile, he contextualizes it. He acknowledges his roots in predictive waterfall, but highlights his evolution into scaled Agile, and explicitly connects that evolution to the current reality of the bank. He's showing them he understands the macro trends of their own industry, and he throws in the specific tooling Smartsheet to prove he is a practitioner, not just a theorist like Marcus.
Then he targets the ecosystem. In terms of environment, I have spent most of my career inside large organizations with complex governance structures and multiple senior stakeholders, which I think maps well to what you are describing.
The E-bucket. He is neutralizing the fear of organ rejection. He is directly telling them, I am not intimidated by your bureaucracy. I know how to navigate your complex governance because I literally grew up in it.
And he lands the plane with the behavioral layer. I am comfortable in politically complex environments, and I tend to thrive when there is genuine ambiguity to navigate rather than a perfectly defined brief. The projects I find most energizing are the ones where the requirements are not fully formed yet, and part of the job is helping the business understand what they actually need.
That is the P bucket executed flawlessly. Operationally relevant character traits. He didn't talk about his hobbies. He told them he acts as a strategic partner to the business. He thrives in ambiguity.
The brilliance of David's answer isn't just that it's balanced, it's how he weaponized those visible threads we talked about earlier. Every single thing he highlighted, hybrid delivery, tech transformations, thriving in political ambiguity, is a carefully set trap.
Yes, he is practically forcing the interviewer to lean forward and say, that's fascinating, David. Tell me about a time you had to navigate a politically complex environment with unformed requirements.
And because David intentionally laid that trap, he already has the perfect rehearsed story ready to go in his back pocket. He completely dictated the flow of the next 45 minutes.
He didn't just answer domain one. He architected the entire interview to focus exclusively on his greatest professional strengths.
So we have deconstructed the psychology, we've outlined the peak framework, we've explored selective disclosure, and we've analyzed the personas. Now, what does this all mean for you, the listener? How do you actually operationalize this for your very next interview? This brings us to our final section, the master structure insight and your pre-interview workflow.
We need to synthesize everything into a fundamental psychological shift that you carry into the room. You must internalize the mantra structure rule. Domain one is the skeleton. Interviewers, especially tired ones who have been conducting interviews all day, do not want to invent random questions. They want to follow the path of least resistance. They will ask follow-ups based strictly on what they found most intriguing or most confusing in your opening pitch.
It's the difference between operating passively and operating actively.
Absolutely. The vast majority of candidates operate with a passive subordinate mindset. They feel they are being interviewed. They sit back, anxious, waiting to see what gets thrown at them. The balanced strategic candidate operates with an active peer-to-peer mindset. They feel like they're co-facilitating a high-level business meeting. They are strategically guiding their counterpart toward the topics they are most qualified to discuss.
Okay, let's get incredibly tactical. The source material distills this into 3 exact directives for the listener to execute. What is directive number 1?
Directive 1. Identify your exact peak highlights. Before you ever put on a suit, sit down with a job description and a blank piece of paper. Write down 3 to 5 elements of your history that are hyper-relevant only to this specific opportunity. Force yourself to leave things off the page. Curate your reality.
Directive 2 is where I think most people fail, even if they have the perfect script written out. Sequence and practice out loud. And I know you want to heavily emphasize the out loud part.
I cannot emphasize this enough. The neurochemistry of internal thought is entirely different from the physical mechanics of speech. You must sequence your highlights into the EKEP order, and then you must practice delivering them out loud. Not silently in your head on the train, not mumbling in the shower, out loud at full conversational volume.
Why is the gap between the internal monologue and the spoken word so dangerous?
Because in your head, your ideas are perfectly fluid. But when your mouth actually has to form the words, structure the grammar, and control the pacing for the very first time, it is incredibly clunky. You will stumble. You will use filler words. If you are a mid-level professional trying to step up to a senior role, you must practice the sophisticated vocabulary of leadership out loud until it sounds natural. You need to sound like a peer who is accustomed to speaking to executives, not a subordinate who is nervously asking for permission to speak.
You're literally building muscle memory for your mouth. If the first time you ever articulate your hybrid methodology is in the actual interview chair, you have already lost. All right, and finally, Directive 3. And this might be the hardest one psychologically for high achievers. Stop talking.
Stop talking. It is a massive, incredibly common psychological trap. A candidate will do everything right. They will deliver a brilliant, tightly curated 5-minute peak answer. They land the plane perfectly. But then the interviewer doesn't immediately respond. There is a 2 or 3 second pause, and the candidate panics.
I can feel that anxiety right now. You think, oh no, they didn't like it. I have to keep going. I have to fill the dead air.
Yes. They hate the silence, so they open their mouth again and start rambling about something completely irrelevant, entirely ruining the pristine architecture they just built. You have to actively reframe how you perceive that silence. That silence is not rejection. That silence is processing. You just handed them a dense, highly structured, high-value packet of information. Their brain is literally categorizing your EKEP dimensions and formulating the perfect follow-up question based on your traps.
You just have to let them process.
Exactly. Sitting comfortably in silence, making relaxed eye contact after delivering a definitive answer is massive display of executive presence. It is a power move.
We have covered an immense amount of strategic ground today. Let's distill this into a rapid-fire summary. For everyone listening, I want you to treat this as a printable mental checklist for your interview prep. When you are finalizing your Domain 1 answer, ask yourself 4 questions. Checkbox 1. Did I lead with experience metrics to mathematically prove I operate at their required scale? Checkbox 2. Did I demonstrate knowledge of the craft to prove I am a custodian of methodology, not just winging it? Checkbox 3. Did I map my past environment to their current ecosystem to eliminate the fear of a bad fit? And checkbox 4. Did I highlight personal traits that map exclusively to the operational reality of the role, leaving my hobbies at the door?
If you can confidently check all 4 of those boxes, you are no longer just answering a question. You are controlling the room. You walk in with an unfair advantage.
Now, before we wrap up, we have to look ahead. Because if you thought Domain 1 required discipline, you are not prepared for Domain 2. In episode 6 of the original Source series, they tackle the motivation questions. Why do you want to work here? Why are you leaving your current role?
And the warning the sources issue about Domain 2 is incredibly stark. They state that motivation questions destroy otherwise phenomenal experienced candidates. Why? Because the candidate's instinctive, honest answer almost always communicates the exact wrong psychological signal.
You think you are showing eager enthusiasm, but the hiring manager actually hears deep systemic desperation. It completely undercuts your value. You absolutely do not want to walk into that trap blindly, so please make sure you are subscribed to this deep dive. The frameworks we are unpacking here compound episode by episode, and you need all 5 domains to complete the system.
Also, if you're the type of learner who wants to skip the frantic note-taking and just absorb the complete written system, every framework, every psychological strategy, every single word-for-word example answer across all 5 domains, there's a PDF guide available. It is specifically designed to be read the night before an interview to lock in your strategy. It is an instant download for $9.99, and the link to the guide is right down in the description.
And if you find yourself in a highly specific, nuanced career situation, maybe you have a massive gap in your resume, or you're attempting a radical industry pivot, and you need to work through your exact peak framework directly with an expert, there is a coaching offer available. You can work through your specific narrative with a coach, and the first 4 sessions are completely free. Again, you can find that link in the description.
The tools are there. The frameworks are proven. The only variable left is your willingness to prepare.
Which leaves us with one final thought for you to mull over today. Think back to that massive jigsaw puzzle we discussed at the very beginning of this hour. Are you still planning on walking into your next major interview, dumping 1,000 random, uncurated pieces of your professional life onto the table, and just hoping the exhausted hiring manager is kind enough and patient enough to put you together? Or are you going to walk into that room with a beautifully framed, fully assembled picture, completely ready to dictate the exact conversation you want to have? Do not wing it. Architecture your success.